Following the fall of France, few outside of Britain gave her much chance of holding out for long. Certainly not the majority of the German people. Hoping that this would be the end of the conflict, part of her territory had now been occupied. For on the 30th of June 1940, German troops had landed on and occupied the Channel Islands. Winston Churchill stood resolute. Britain and her empire would fight on regardless. With his keen sense of history, Churchill was conscious that Britain had not been successfully invaded for nearly 900 years. British people, too, greeted the French surrender with almost a sense of relief. Now they could fight on unencumbered by continental alliances.
Now, in the full light of the after-time, it is easy to see where we were ignorant or too much alarmed, where we were careless or clumsy. Twice in 2 months we had been taken completely by surprise. The overrunning of Norway and the breakthrough at Sedan, with all that followed from these, proved the deadly power of the German initiative. What else had they got ready, prepared and organized to the last inch? Would they suddenly pounce out of the blue with new weapons, perfect planning, and overwhelming force upon our almost totally unequipped and disarmed island at any one of a dozen or score of possible landing places? Or would they go to Ireland? He would have been a very foolish man who allowed his reasoning, however clean-cut and seeming sure, to blot out any possibility against which provision could be made. Depend upon it, said Dr. Johnson, when a man knows he's going to be hanged in a month, it concentrates his mind wonderfully. I was always sure we should win, but nevertheless I was highly geared up by the situation and very thankful to be able to make my views effective. This was a time when all Britain worked and strove to the utmost limit and was united as never before. Men and women toiled at the lathes and machines in the factories till they fell exhausted on the floor and had to be dragged away and ordered home, while their places were occupied by newcomers ahead of time. The one desire of all the males and many women was to have a weapon. The cabinet and government were locked together by bonds the memory of which is still cherished by all. The sense of fear seemed entirely lacking in the people, and their representatives in Parliament were not unworthy of their mood. We had not suffered like France under the German flail. Nothing moves an Englishman so much as the threat of invasion, the reality unknown for 1,000 years. Vast numbers of people were resolved to conquer or die. There was no need to rouse their spirit by oratory. They were glad to hear me express their sentiments and give them good reasons for what they meant to do, or try to do. The only possible divergence was from people who wished to do even more than was possible and had the idea that frenzy might shorten action. In these days, my principal fear was of German tanks coming ashore. Since my mind was attracted to landing tanks on their coasts, I naturally thought they might have the same idea. We had hardly any anti-tank guns or ammunition, or even ordinary field artillery. The plight to which we were reduced in dealing with this danger may be measured from the following incident. I visited our beaches in St. Margaret's Bay near Dover. The brigadier informed me that he had only 3 anti-tank guns in his brigade, covering 4 or 5 miles of this highly menaced coastline. He declared that he had only 6 rounds of ammunition for each gun, and he asked me with a slight air of challenge whether he was justified in letting his men fire 1 single round for practice, in order that they might at least know how the weapon worked. I replied that we could not afford practice rounds, and that fire should be held to the last moment at the closest range. For the first time in 125 years, a powerful enemy was now established across the narrow waters of the English Channel. Our reformed regular army and the larger but less well-trained territorials had to be organized and deployed to create an elaborate system of defenses and to stand ready if the invader came to destroy him, for there could be no escape. It was for both sides kill or cure. Already the Home Guard could be included in the general framework of defense. On June the 25th, General Ironside, Commander-in-Chief of the Home Forces, exposed his plans to the Chiefs of Staff. They were, of course, scrutinized with anxious care by the experts, and I examined them myself with no little attention. On the whole, they stood approved. There were three main elements in this early outline of a great future plan. First, an entrenched crust on the probable invasion beaches of the coast, whose defenders should fight where they stood, supported by mobile reserves for immediate counterattack. Secondly, a line of anti-tank obstacles manned by the Home Guard running down the east centre of England and protecting London and the great industrial centres from inroads by armoured vehicles. Thirdly, behind that line, the main reserves for major counter-offensive action. In these summer days of 1940, after the fall of France, we were all alone. None of the British dominions or India or the colonies could send decisive aid or send what they had in time. The victorious, enormous German armies, thoroughly equipped and with large reserves of captured weapons and arsenals behind them, were gathering for the final stroke. Italy, with numerous and imposing forces, had declared war upon us and eagerly sought our destruction in the Mediterranean and in Egypt. In the Far East, Japan glared inscrutably and pointedly requested the closing of the Burma Road against supplies for China. Soviet Russia was bound to Nazi Germany by her pact and lent important aid to Hitler in raw materials. The France of Pétain and Bordeaux soon moved to Vichy and might at any day be forced to declare war upon us. Certainly we had no lack of foes. Deep alarm spread through the United States and indeed through all the surviving free countries. Americans gravely asked themselves whether it was right to cast away any of their own severely limited resources to indulge a generous though hopeless sentiment. Ought they not to strain every nerve and nurse every weapon to remedy their own unpreparedness? It needed a very sure judgment to rise above these cogent, matter-of-fact arguments. The gratitude of the British nation is due to the noble President and his great officers and high advisers for never, even in the advent of the third term presidential election, losing their confidence in our fortunes or our will. The buoyant and imperturbable temper of Britain, which I had the honor to express, may well have turned the scale. Here was this people who in the years before the war had gone to the extreme bounds of pacifism and improvidence, who had indulged in the sport of party politics, and who, though so weakly armed, had advanced light-heartedly into the center of European affairs, now confronted with the reckoning alike of their virtuous impulses and neglectful arrangements. They were not even dismayed. They defied the conquerors of Europe. They seemed willing to have their island reduced to a shambles rather than give in. This would make a fine page in history. Few British and very few foreigners understood the peculiar technical advantages of our insular position, nor was it generally known how even in the irresolute years before the war, the essentials of sea and latterly air defense had been maintained. It was nearly 1,000 years since Britain had seen the fires of a foreign camp on English soil. There was also another aspect. One of our greatest dangers during June lay in having our last reserves drawn away from us into a wasting, futile French resistance in France, and the strength of our air forces gradually worn down by their flights or transference to the continent. If Hitler had been gifted with supernatural wisdom, he would have slowed down the attack on the French front, making perhaps a pause of 3 or 4 weeks after Dunkirk on the line of the Seine, and meanwhile developing its preparations to invade England. Thus he would have had a deadly option and could have tortured us with the hooks of either deserting France in our agony or squandering the last resources for our future existence. The more we urged the French to fight on, the greater was our obligation to aid them, and the more difficult it would have become to make any preparations for defense in England. and above all to keep in reserve the 25 squadrons of fighter aircraft on which all depended. On this point, we should never have given way, but the refusal would have been bitterly resented by our struggling ally and would have poisoned all our relations. It was even with an actual sense of relief that some of our high commanders addressed themselves to our new and grimly simplified problem. As the commissioner at one of the service clubs in London said to a rather downcast member, "Anyhow, sir, we're in the final, and it's to be played on the home ground." We settled ourselves down with increasing assurance that we could make a long and hard fight. Our gains of strength were borne in upon us from day to day. The entire population labored to the last limit of its strength and felt rewarded when they fell asleep after their toil or vigil by a growing sense that we should have time and that we should win. All the beaches now bristled with defences of various kinds. The whole country was organized in defensive localities. The factories poured out their weapons. We had over 250 new tanks. The fruits of the American Act of Faith had been gathered. The whole trained professional British Army and its territorial comrades drilled and exercised from morn till night and longed to meet the foe. The Home Guard overtopped the million mark, and when rifles were lacking, grasped lustily the shotgun, the sporting rifle, the private pistol, or, when there was no firearm, the pike and the club. No fifth column existed in Britain, though a few spies were carefully rounded up and examined. What few communists there were lay low. Everyone else gave all they had to give. I've often wondered, however, what would have happened if 200,000 German stormtroops had actually established themselves ashore. The massacre would have been on both sides grim and great. There would have been neither mercy nor quarter. They would have used terror, and we were prepared to go all lengths. I intended to use the slogan, "You can always take one with you." I even calculated that the horrors of such a scene would in the last resort turn the scale in the United States. But none of these emotions was put to the proof. Far out on the grey waters of the North Sea and the Channel, coursed and patrolled the faithful, eager flotillas peering through the night. High in the air soared the fighter pilots, or waited serene at a moment's notice around their excellent machines. This was a time when it was equally good to live or die.
Hitler issued his formal directive for the invasion of Britain, Operation Sea Lion, in mid-July, just before he made a peace offering to Britain. 20 divisions would be used. They would land on a broad front on the south coast of England. Once ashore, they would advance northwards and encircle London. Hitler recognized, though, that the invasion would only be successful as long as he had total air supremacy over the invasion area. Thus, while the army gathered barges from all over Europe and rehearsed its crossing of the English Channel, the German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, was to engage and destroy the RAF. But Grand Admiral Erich Raeder, the naval commander-in-chief, complained that his ships could not guarantee the security of such a wide front against the might of the British Navy. While the Army and the Navy argued, the Luftwaffe, under an impatient Hermann Goering, quickly got on with its planning and prepared to strike the first blow against Britain. Hugo Sperl would command one of the two air fleets based in France and the Low Countries. Albert Kesselring would command the other. Hermann Goering, a veteran pilot of the First World War and architect of the Luftwaffe, had once said, "Born of the spirit of the German airmen of World War I, inspired by its faith in our Führer and Commander-in-Chief, thus stands the German Air Force today, ready to carry out every command of the Führer with lightning speed and undreamt-of might. On the 10th of July, even before Hitler had issued his invasion directive, the Luftwaffe opened what would become known as the Battle of Britain. 70 German aircraft raided the docks of Cardiff in South Wales. The damage caused was the first sign of things to come. Thereafter, for the rest of the month, the Luftwaffe tried to tempt the RAF into air battles over the Channel through attacks on British shipping there. The RAF, however, refused to be totally drawn. Air Chief Marshal Sir Hugh Dowding, who led Fighter Command, realized that his 600 fighters were faced by 2,500 German aircraft. He could not afford to risk them prematurely. Ships in the Channel were therefore often left to fend for themselves. The priceless asset that Dowding had, however, was radar. This had been developed during the 1930s, and by July 1940, the network had been developed to cover Britain's east and south coasts. The radar operators passed details of the approaching aircraft to the fighter control rooms. The Luftwaffe, although now close to Britain, did have some problems. Its bombers, the Heinkel HE-111 and Dornier DO-17 and Junkers Ju-88, could only carry a limited load of bombs. Their range was comparatively short. The Ju-88 had been the subject of much modification and had been extensively remodeled. This bomber was the true backbone of the Luftwaffe's bombing force in 1940. Produced in greater numbers than all of the other German bombers combined, some 15,000 being built between 1939 and 1945. The Heinkel HE-111 was the first modern medium bomber to be acquired by the Luftwaffe and was to carry the major burden of the German bombing offensive against the British Isles. This aircraft, known to the Germans as the scourge of Europe and the aircraft that conquered nations, a supreme weapon was the Junkers Ju-87 dive bomber. This angularly ugly aircraft attained greater notoriety during Hitler's Blitzkrieg, its armor and defenses paralyzing whole armies, playing havoc with communications in vital rear areas and hounding the streams of refugees. With virtually no aerial opposition, the Ju-87 presumed control of the air. The Messerschmitt Bf 109 was the Luftwaffe's premier single-seat fighter. This aircraft had proved itself against the RAF over Dunkirk and was to be used as the principal fighter support aircraft for the bomber squadrons. The RAF's Hawker Hurricanes were amongst the finest fighters ever built during the period. With their wood and canvas construction, they were able to absorb an incredible amount of battle damage from opposing fighters. These aircraft were to become the workhorses of the Battle of Britain. The Supermarine Spitfire is perhaps the one real aircraft that was to achieve a legendary status and one that was to pose a real problem for the Luftwaffe. During the preceding battle, Goering was once asked by Hitler what he would need to defeat the RAF. He replied, "I would like a squadron of Spitfires." The 30th of July brought a lull in the Luftwaffe raids over the south coast and marked the end of the first phase of the battle. Churchill, ever keen to keep up morale, toured the ports of Plymouth and Southampton, which had seen heavy attacks. He was most profoundly touched by the fighting spirit of the people. "Their houses are low," he said, "but their hearts are high." At Portsmouth, he surveyed the bomb damage. Everywhere he was greeted with great warmth as the crowds of people gathered wanted to shake him by the hand. He inspected 3 French ships and also took time to inspect Nelson's flagship, Victory. As he toured the dockyard, there was little evidence of enemy action, but a great deal of evidence of Mr. Churchill's tremendous popularity. The British were also starting to benefit from another technical breakthrough. They were beginning to be able to read German radio messages, encrypted by the Enigma coding machine. This was thanks to the Poles, who had got hold of an Enigma machine before the war. The code breakers operated in a country house called Bletchley Park in the middle of England, and their efforts, codenamed Ultra, were to have a significant effect on the course of the war. The second phase of the battle began in earnest on the 12th of August, when Goering launched attacks against the RAF's eyes, the radar stations, as well as airfields. One radar station was knocked out, but from now on, the Luftwaffe made a fatal error in leaving them alone in order to concentrate on airfields. more and more of the RAF's airfields were badly damaged. The only technical assistance prior to radar, which was available in detecting enemy aircraft before they crossed the coast, came in the form of acoustic listening devices or acoustic mirrors. If conditions were good, these could pick up an aircraft about 7 miles out to sea. The use of these devices, however, was highly problematical, since wind, surf, and atmospheric noise severely degraded their performance. Assuming the bombers were detected, a message would then be sent back through the control system. The position of the enemy would then be transmitted to the fighter stations. The anti-aircraft batteries along the coastline would also be put on alert. The acoustic systems were soon modified, and new developments were made alongside radar in detecting enemy aircraft. Once the enemy had been sighted, the direction finders would mark the targets. These gun batteries were successful in shooting down aircraft that tried to creep in under the radar. The losses sustained by the Luftwaffe during the period of July and August had been bearable. But it was clear that the RAF was an effective fighting force and was not suffering sufficiently heavy damage as to affect their capability. It now became necessary for the Luftwaffe's bombers to try and penetrate further inland in order to destroy a higher percentage of RAF fighters on the ground. But such was the ferocity of the RAF fighter pilots that 3 times the number of the escorting fighters over the figures originally estimated were found to be needed for adequate support for the bomber formations. In addition, the long-range fighters needed for such support were hopelessly outclassed by the Spitfires and Hurricanes in fighter versus fighter combat. By now, the attacks by the Luftwaffe had intensified. The pace and strength of the campaign was kept up, the Luftwaffe losing over 500 aircraft as a result. Although the British too had heavy losses, with over 200 aircraft lost. The time for establishing air superiority over Britain was running out for the Luftwaffe, and its achievement now called for desperate measures. The effort was laid on knocking out the RAF on the ground, with the emphasis on those aircraft deployed around London. The fierce fighting that ensued was unprecedented, and losses were high on both sides. For the RAF, it was reaching crisis point, with its squadrons of experienced yet battle-weary pilots bearing the major share. On the 15th of August, the largest Luftwaffe attacks yet mounted took place. Goering called this day Eagle Day and watched his armada fly over the French coast. There was also an attack by aircraft based in Norway and Denmark, designed to draw the RAF fighters away from the south. Radar enabled these attacks to be plotted as they built up. The RAF fighters rose once more to intercept them. Soon, fierce air battles were taking place. The British fighters initially concentrating on attacking the German bombers. The German fighters joined in. The RAF, however, was able to repulse these attacks. This pattern continued for the next few days. Even so, by the 18th of August, RAF Fighter Command was becoming stretched. Damage to airfields was also disrupting the command and control system. More serious were the RAF casualties. The intensity of the battle was gradually reducing Fighter Command's strength. While its losses were only half those of the Luftwaffe, its relative small size meant that it could ill afford these. Supply of replacement aircraft was not the main problem, thanks to the efforts of the newspaper magnate Lord Beaverbrook, who had been appointed to overhaul aircraft manufacture earlier in the year, and whose son was a fighter pilot. Aircraft production more than matched losses, but more than 150 pilots had been killed or badly wounded, and this was serious. And output of newly trained pilots was simply not keeping up with losses. Those who were able to continue flying were becoming increasingly exhausted, having to be on alert from dawn to dusk and flying as many as 3 or 4 sorties a day. Churchill recognized only too well the strain they were under, but also the fact that if they lost this battle, Britain might go under. On the 20th of August, he made his famous speech.
Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few.
The Germans, too, were suffering especially from bomber losses. Consequently, from the 24th of August, the start of the third phase of the battle, the Luftwaffe began to send over an increasing proportion of fighters, hoping to hack the RAF down in the air. RAF losses now began to creep upwards and were close to matching those of the Luftwaffe. German fighters were now crossing the Channel at low level to reduce their vulnerability to radar detection, climbing once they were over the coast, and then clashing with Spitfires and Hurricanes. On the night of the 20th of August, however, a bomber inadvertently dropped bombs on London. The next night, the RAF retaliated by bombing Berlin. It was the beginning of a campaign which would be costly to both sides, both in aircraft losses and ground damage. The third phase of the battle was drawing to a close. Hitler, enraged by the attacks on Germany, laid out his orders with Goering for the fourth phase of the invasion plan. In retaliation, he switched his air attacks away from the airfields and radar stations and declared a prolonged and concentrated attack on British cities. Civilians were now to become the primary target for the bombers of the Luftwaffe. London was to be the first city hit. The people of London had been well prepared for such an attack. The anti-aircraft defenses were all on standby. The skies over the city were full of barrage balloons. The RAF also had many squadrons based around the capital. The British people had been preparing for months. Shelters had been constructed. The city's children had been evacuated to the safety of the countryside. London was ready to take whatever Hitler could throw against it. And, as an extra measure of precaution, the city's lights had been blacked out. On the 7th of September, in the late afternoon, London was subjected to a massive air attack. The fourth phase had begun. That same night, the code word Cromwell was issued to all defending forces in the south of England. It meant that invasion was probable within 24 hours. The damage was incomparable to anything that had gone before, and this was only a foretaste of what was yet to come for the people of London. American broadcaster Quentin Reynolds summed up those early days of the Blitz in a moving broadcast to the USA.
I'm speaking from London. It is late afternoon, and the people of London are preparing for the night. Everyone is anxious to get home before darkness falls, before our nightly visitors arrive. This is the London rush hour. Many of the people at whom you are looking now are members of the greatest civilian army ever to be assembled. These men and women who have worked all day in offices or in markets are now hurrying home to change into the uniform of their particular service. The dusk is deepening. Listening crews are posted all the way from the coast to London to pick up the drone of the German planes. Soon the nightly battle of London will be on. This has been a quiet day for us, but it won't be a quiet night. We haven't had a quiet night now for more than 5 weeks. They'll be over tonight, and they'll destroy a few buildings and kill a few people, probably some of the people you are watching now. Now they're going into the public shelters. This is not a pleasant way to spend the night, but the people accept it as their part in the defense of London. These civilians are good soldiers. Now it's 8 o'clock. Jerry is a little bit late tonight. The searchlights are in position. The guns are ready. The People's Army of Volunteers is ready. They are the ones who are really fighting this war. The firemen, the air raid wardens, the ambulance drivers. And there's the wail of the banshee. The nightly siege of London has begun. The city is dressed for battle. Here they come. Now the searchlights are poking long, white, inquisitive fingers into the blackness of the night. These are not Hollywood sound effects. This is the music they play every night in London, the symphony of war. That was a bomb. Very old, with that deep wisdom given only to the very young and the very old, sleep in the shelters. Do you see any signs of fear on these faces? Now the army of the people swings into action. The bombs have started fires. When the bomber starts a fire, he immediately returns, uses it as a target, and drops more bombs, hoping to spread the fire. Yet the People's Army ignores the bombs and the spent shrapnel which rains down constantly. Brokers, clerks, peddlers, merchants by day, they are heroes by night. The night is long, but sooner or later the dawn will come. The German bombers are creatures of the night. They melt away before the dawn and scurry back to the safety of their own airdromes. And there's the wail of the banshee again, this time a friendly wail. The all-clear signal tells us that the bombers have gone. It's just 6 a.m. In this last hour of precious sleep, this strange new world finds peace. London does this every morning. London doesn't look down upon the ruins of its houses, upon those made homeless during the night, upon the remains of churches, hospitals, workers' flats. London looks upwards toward the dawn and faces the new day with calmness and confidence. The People's Army go to work as they did in that other comfortable world which came to an end when the invader began to attack the last strongholds of freedom. Not all the services run as they did yesterday, but London manages to get to work on time, one way or another. In the center of the city, the shops are open as usual. In fact, many of them are more open than usual. Dr. Paul Joseph Gibbles said recently that the nightly air raids have had a terrific effect upon the morale of the people of London. The good doctor is absolutely right. Today, the morale of the people is higher than ever before. They are fused together, not by fear, but by a surging spirit of courage, the like of which the world has never known. They know that thousands of them will die, but they would rather stand up and face death than kneel down and face the kind of existence the conqueror would impose upon them. And they know, too, and are comforted by the thought that England is not taking its beating lying down. They are guarding the frontiers of freedom. It is hard to see 5 centuries of labor destroyed in 5 seconds. But London is fighting back. I am a neutral reporter. I have watched the people of London live and die ever since death in its most ghastly garb began to come here as a nightly visitor 5 weeks ago. I have watched them stand by their homes. I have seen them made homeless. I have seen them moved to new homes. And I can assure you, there is no panic, no fear, no despair in London town. There is nothing but determination, confidence, and high courage among the people of Churchill's Island. And they know that every night the RAF bombers fly deep into the heart of Germany, bombing munition works, airplane factories, canals, cutting the arteries which keep the heart of Germany alive. It is true that the Nazis will be over again tomorrow night, and the night after that, and every night. They will drop thousands of bombs, and they'll destroy hundreds of buildings, and they'll kill thousands of people. But a bomb has its limitations. It can only destroy buildings and kill people. It cannot kill the unconquerable spirit and courage of the people of London. London can take it.
Churchill's few, the RAF fighter pilots defending Britain during the summer of 1940, were on average no more than 20 years of age. Most of them were unmarried. Most of them had not completed their formal education. Prior to being posted to an operational squadron, they had only 10 months' service with the RAF and had less than 20 hours flying experience on their Spitfire and Hurricane chariots. In the desperate defense of their homeland, these eager and brave young men fought a daily contest of wits, skill, and matchless courage with an equally skilled and determined opponent. During this main period of the assault, the RAF lost 103 pilots killed and another 128 seriously wounded, with an overall loss of 466 Spitfires and Hurricanes. The pilots were utterly exhausted. The fighting was taking a stark toll on the squadrons. However, the Luftwaffe's switch to London gave the RAF the respite it needed. It gave them time to regroup and rearm. Although this was a moment of relief for the hard-hit fighter command structure, there was only a modicum of ease for the pilots, who were now called on to defend the heart of the British Empire. On the 10th of September, Hitler, anxious that the Luftwaffe losses were unbearably high and that they were not gaining control of the skies over England, decided to postpone Operation Sea Lion for a further 2 weeks. Reich Marshal Hermann Goering, the supreme commander of the Luftwaffe, was convinced that his pilots were invincible. It is undeniable that many of the German fighter aces had unbelievably high scores of kill rate. In fact, 2 of them actually achieved shooting down over 300 aircraft each in aerial combat, one of them attaining a staggering 352. However, most of these were scored much later in the war on the Eastern Front against the Soviet Air Force. Their scoring during the Battle of Britain was much lower by proportion. Nevertheless, Germany's fighter aces must be credited with outstanding and often astonishing achievements in the air. In their devotion to their country and their unquenchable courage and sheer tenacity in the face of an equally skilled opponent, they must stand equal as they hurled themselves relentlessly to the limit of human endurance. Despite rumors to the contrary, these young men followed the same code of ethics as displayed by the British fighter pilots. However, they did have one disadvantage. Like all Germans of their generation, they suffered the same anguish as the consequences of the Hitler period consumed their fatherland. Also, unlike the British, the pilots of the Luftwaffe were let down badly by a poor high command. The frequent failures and misjudgments of the significant personalities on whom these fighter pilots depended were unprecedented at that time in military history.